Folks are still trickling in, but hello and welcome. Thank you to everyone who is joining us, taking time out of their day this morning or afternoon. My name is Daniel Tam Claiborne, and I'm the Executive Director of the Serica Initiative, a New York-based nonprofit that has really two missions. One is to galvanize a global community of changemakers to advocate for greater Asian American inclusion. And the second is advancing positive social impact in U.S.-China relations. We do this really through three mechanisms: dialogue, storytelling, and our convening power. And one of the primary ways in which we do carry out our mission is by catalyzing the business and social sectors to collaborate on some of the most pressing issues shaping China's relationship with the world, including sustainability, climate, and ESG. This webinar, of course, is one example of that. And we're really thrilled to be partnering with NYenvironcom and its founder director, Alex Scilla, to be hosting this fascinating panel entitled Grassroots Recycling Post-China's Waste Import Ban, the History, the People, and the Social and Environmental Benefits. So before I turn things over to Alex, I'd just like to highlight two very quick upcoming programs for Serica. The first is our next webinar, which is on exploring low carbon initiatives and collaboration in Southeast Asia. That'll be on March 5th at 9 a.m. Eastern, where we'll be discussing the Vietnam Low Carbon Rice Initiative, as well as the rigors measuring carbon credits in developing countries. Secondly, Serica's annual API Women's Gala is coming up this May. It'll be held on May 14th at Tribeca 360 in New York. For the last 8 years, we've endeavored to shine a spotlight on visionary women leaders shaping U.S.-China relations and have highlighted over 100 women in various industries looking to make their mark on the world and support peaceful ties between East and West. This year, we've evolved our event to include not just Chinese or Chinese American women, but API women with outstanding achievements and contributions in their respective fields. All proceeds from the gala will go to supporting API storytelling programs and causes. You can find out more information about how to purchase tickets and our incredible list of honorees at our website. The best way, of course, to stay current on all our programs and events is to subscribe to our newsletter and to follow us on social media. So we'll drop some links in the chat momentarily. And so without further ado, I'd like to throw things over to Alex, let him introduce NYenvironcom and today's amazing set of panelists. Thank you all so much for being here. Oh, sorry, Alex, I think you're muted.
Right. Just had the video, but not the sound. So now we're on there all the way. So again, thanks, Daniel, introduction. Thanks, Serica, for partnering with us to make this event happen. So my name's Alex Scilla. I'm the founder of nonprofit NYenvironcom, which is newish. We're going into our 4th year. And before that, well, concurrently with that, I've been in the recycling business for a little, closing in on 20 years now, though with an asterisk, COVID, we didn't do much, obviously, with the travel bans and all of that. But it did give me time to focus on building this nonprofit, which grew out of some of the work I did. So we have Aaron Eagles down in the corner on the chat. He worked with me on some of the predecessor programs, which were very recycling focused. We had a program with international schools. We did like a corporate CSR and all that, which led me to found NYenvironcom. Though NYenvironcom became more land use focused just because of the need here in New York was important, but I'd always had the desire to get a recycling event focused, and I'm happy that today is our first recycling event, and hopefully the first of many. Hopefully this is something we'll do on an annual basis in some way, or something will grow out of it. But we're getting some recycling in our portfolio, and this is the start. Just to in a little while, I'll introduce our panelists, Ryan, Blair, and Samantha. But I want to talk a little bit about kind of a little overview of recycling, how it relates to why we're talking about grassroots recycling, how we came to that, a little history on that. I mean, I try to squeeze what I can in here. If we go back too far, we'd be here for 3 hours in one. I mean, look, recycling's been around some way, shape, or form. You can go back to Roman times, people were remelting metals, reusing stone, all that. But the overlap between the grassroots, the three things we're linking together: the grassroots, the immigration aspect, and how that interplays with the policy, especially some of the policy in the last 20 years around import exports that gets us to the ban, and how that's affected. And the grassroots has been there pretty much since the start of the Industrial Revolution, which also broadly coincides with immigration patterns. You go back 100 years, the first, people who really brought recycling into America, had the Italian and the Jewish immigrants, which, it's personally relevant to me, being as my ethnic and cultural heritage also extends down from that. So, they were there. It was a little different in those days. It was more metal, rubber, rags, things that you don't see. Obviously, with industry, the material stream has changed over the years. But the recycling industry has kind of gone along with that immigration, with the later waves of immigration, the later Asian, Latin heavy waves. That's who a lot of people see working in the grassroots themselves. And even overseas, even to take it to China, a lot of people, when I first went there, so in the 2000s, when I got few years before I got into the recycling business. But the people friends I had there, probably years ago, they were actually in the recycling business. They were in the trade, the import export aspect of it. And at that time, I lived on the first floor. And when you live on the first floor, you had these peddlers outside every day coming by the window with they had like a little kind of song, a little thing that, purchasing recycling material. So you see it on a very grassroots level. And a lot of those were internal migrants. They weren't international immigrants, but they were immigrants from inland parts that came to the cities that followed the wave of industrialization that was happening at that time and saw the opportunities for recycling. So they represented that very ground level, grassroots level of recycling. That mirrored a lot. You can see pictures from 20 years ago of some of these collectors. You can see pictures from 100 years ago, and you see people kind of similar trucks, car setups and all that. So it's always been that, and it's always been an important part of the industry, even though, it doesn't have the same kind of tracking, that you have your, marketing, the industrial side. So people see the bins out, they see the haulers, and that's one side. But then you also have these grassroots recyclers, which have tend, if you're not in the industry, you're not paying attention, they can be overlooked, but they're a huge part of it. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And we'll also look at how some of the policies, obviously, the 90s started from the 90s, recycling kind of got supercharged just by, large part to China and East Asia as a buyer of these materials. They were just buying things in bulk, and they were buying things that weren't getting recycled before because, it's hard to collect, it was hard to process, all that. But the demand and all that just, pushed that into the era we've been in for the last 20, 30 years. But then, in the 2016s, export policies changed, and that shook the whole thing up again, just because certain grades that were able to be shipped weren't being shipped, cost structures changed, all that. And that can obviously affect the whole structure of grassroots. Then COVID a couple of years later, so we're probably going to another transitional period. But still there, it's always going to be there, people working, how it affects them. And that's what we'll talk to our panelists today, to Ryan, Blair, Samantha. And they all come with different perspectives. I expect we'll get a robust debate. And obviously these days there's some controversy. The media lately has done a lot of things on recycling, and you hear a lot of different things, some more factual, more nuanced than others, some a little less nuanced, a little sensationalist. But it is something that's been in people's minds in a way that in the last it wasn't as much. It was a little more invisible, just because things had kind of settled in a way, now they're shook up. So yeah, we'll talk about it, and then at the end we'll recognize some of these guys at the grassroots and what they do, because it's important, because they're out there, they're doing it, and they're picking up the slack in a lot of cases for people kind of who care about it, but may not always be bothered to practice it in the way that it needs to be practiced. So yeah, I guess we'll just get into it. I'll do a little introduction of Ryan, Samantha, and Blair. I guess if you guys want to turn your cameras on now so we can all see you. All right, so Samantha, we have her bio here, and then I'll let her fill in if I miss things. So she's been a public servant. She's recently retired. She was at the NYC Department of Sanitation. Now she's at CUNY Baruch, where she's working to improve recycling and waste management, working with master's students in urban environmentalism, as well as advising Earth Matter New York, which is a community-based NGO responding to the dual problems of resource recovery and healthy soils with a single solution, promoting the local compost of organic waste into a healthy soil amendment. We have Blair Horner here from the New York Public Interest Research Group, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan watchdog in New York that works to strengthen democracy, fight for the rights of consumers and voters, and protecting the environment and public health. He's been in support of strong policy and legislation in New York to ensure that we're moving into a clean, renewable energy future. And then we have Ryan Castalia, who works directly with many of the canners and grassroots recyclers we're going to be talking about, who's the executive director at Sure We Can, which is for how many years, Ryan? I missed that. It's the
since 2020.
Since 2020. All right, so going into his fourth year here, which is a diverse community organization in New York, a place in Brooklyn works with over 1,000 canners to promote economic opportunities to individuals outside of traditional employment models. Many of you come from underserved and excluded demographics, going beyond income generation, providing respect and a social support system, helping people feel valued, integrated, respected, and empowered. And this community of canners includes people from all backgrounds, African American, Hispanic, Asian, Caucasian, from over 20 countries. All right, so if I missed anything, if anyone wants to add anything, otherwise we can get into some of these panel questions and discussions. I guess you guys should get off mute, otherwise you won't be able to answer these questions. So yeah, I guess we'll just go from side to side. So Samantha, Ryan, Blair, and obviously jump in if needed as the discussion progresses. But if you want to introduce anything else about yourself or tell us, a little bit about your experience and background, how that interacts with the grassroots and recycling in general, whether it's a policy, structural levels, whatever. Yeah, however you want to present it. So Samantha, if you want to start with you, I guess.
Okay, well, thanks for the introduction. Just wanted to also point out I also work for the Department of Environmental Protection, and that I'm an active scholar in the area of waste management, and specifically a sort of a subfield called discard studies that really looks at power, social power, political power, the uses of power and misuses of them in the whole area of waste management. I am very committed to the power of the grassroots sector in New York City, specifically in the area of composting, and I'm currently working with many groups trying to fight against the really devastating cuts to grassroots community composting that have been instituted after a 30-year program of including them. And I would also say that, and I'd be glad to talk about this more, there is an inherent contradiction between the structure of the New York State bottle bill and the structure of curbside recycling in New York City. I am a big supporter of bottle bills. They work, and we should be increasing the deposit and putting it on more items, not less.
All right, so let's move on to Ryan over here.
Hey, just want to say thanks to Serica and Alex and NYenvironcom for putting this together. Happy to be here. Excuse me. And I just want to kind of follow up on what Samantha's saying, which I think is really meaningful, which is, our work is not just in the space of recycling, but also in the space of social movements and economics. I mean, and really the principles of our work come from the place that these things aren't really separable, that the way we treat materials and the way we treat each other are inextricably tied. I mean, and I think, and this is the notion of environmental justice at its root, and the fact that these, when we talk about solutions to the waste crisis, we can't just talk about, oh, how do we get rid of this material, or put it in a way that makes it invisible. We have to talk about, how does it move, who benefits, where does the value move, and who does it help, and how can people participate. And especially with something on the scope, the scale of the waste crisis that we're in right now, our general feeling is that this is a all hands on deck kind of situation, and that solutions that don't include grassroots workers, folks who are really, at least in the case of New York City where we work, people who are overcoming tremendous barriers in order to offer their labor power to communities and have an impact on some of these issues. In addition, of course, to earning income and benefiting their communities, which in most cases are also communities that have been overburdened by pollution and waste historically. It's just critical that we work together and involve people on every level, the institutional level, the corporate level, and most meaningfully, the interpersonal grassroots level, where a lot of this stuff really happens. So especially given, I'm looking forward to this conversation in the sense that we're talking about movement away from China, and I'm sure the notion of relocalization will arise, and how these systems need to be sensitive to the needs and conditions in different communities, and of course to the people who are going to be operating them and benefiting from them. And so thanks again for having me.
All right. Well, thanks for being here, Ryan and Blair.
Well, again, thank you for inviting me, and thank you to everyone who's viewing this. I guess I'll pick up where pick up some of Ryan's points a little bit. I mean, NYPIRG is a statewide organization. We tend to focus on state policies more than anything, although we do get involved in local issues in New York City and federal issues as well. And I started with NYPIRG in the late 1970s, knocking on doors because of waste policies, both toxic and solid. And I was working on Long Island. And Long Island is, for those of you who don't know, includes Brooklyn and Queens. It's a giant sandbar. And when you dump things on top of it, it ends up getting leached into the ground. Long Island, Nassau and Suffolk counties rely on groundwater for their drinking water source. And so that obviously is a problem if you will allow all sorts of waste to be dumped on top of it, and then you end up drinking it. And so we've been very involved for years in both toxic pollution and solid waste management as ways to sort of deal with that kind of problem. And it ties in with what happened with China, because in many ways the way that the pressure cooker would let off some steam would be that a lot of waste from the United States would end up going to Asia. Now you can't do that as much as we used to. And here's just some fun facts for you to think about. In the last 50 years, the amount of waste that an American generates is 50% more than it was 50 years ago. In New York, the 25 landfills, the place where we mostly dump our trash, is going to run out of space as early as 16 years from now. The emissions from landfills and solid waste generally constitute 12% of the greenhouse gas emissions that are leading to worldwide catastrophe for every living thing on the planet. So those are some big things, big issues to deal with. And so how do you tackle those problems? Part of it is you have to sort of develop this mentality that we should live in a circular economy where the producers of waste are on the hook for taking them back. And the best example of that, Samantha referenced, is really the bottle law, where we have a system in place where the producer is responsible. And it's been tremendously successful, although it could be a lot better if it gets updated. And that's one of the things that Ryan and I work on at the state capitol. But there's a big problem, and it's not just about picking up the trash at your home, although it is that. The fact that we may be running out of space to dump the stuff will put a lot of pressure on burning more of it, which will make climate catastrophe worse. So we have to tackle this issue by reducing the amount of waste we produce, by reusing it as much as possible, by recycling it before we ever get to the point of wanting to dispose it. So this conversation today, I think it should be hopefully an important discussion in terms of sort of how do we tackle this in a way that deals with the problem and moves from a waste generating society to one that relies on a circular economy. I'll just stop there. Back to you, Alex.
All right. Well, I think we covered a lot of different aspects of it there, but getting into the conversation, I think, we'll just go kind of start at the beginning and move our ways through all those things. So just taking to the beginning, how do we define grassroots recycling? Like, how do you guys personally define grassroots recycling and the other parts of the recycling framework and industry? How do you see that broken up? What's grassroots, what's industry, what is maybe unlabeled or anything else, from your viewpoint, respective viewpoints?
I guess I'll start.
Yeah, we'll just go.
Grassroots, I would define, first of all, it is going to be local or maybe regional. It's not going to get a lot bigger in geographic scale than that. It's going to be coming out of groups that are involved, as Ryan pointed out, not only in just thinking about waste management as a business, and not only even thinking about it as an environmental activity, but also as a jobs activity and an activity that is greater than the sum of its parts. So it has multiple overlapping benefits to communities. It is not serving the interests of big business and profit as much as it is serving the needs of the people that live in cities. That's how I would describe it.
All right, excellent. So, Ryan, anything to build on that or different take?
Sure. I think that's a really strong definition. And I guess what I'd want to add is that as far as what grassroots recycling looks like, I mean, sort of by this token that it's bespoke to different communities, the way it manifests across the world is also highly variable. So, when we're talking about the situation that Sure We Can, the organization I run, works in, it's a very, very specific context that's organized by the social environment, right? And specifically the bottle bill, for example, the law. But of course, also more intangible things like the culture that it exists in. So the relationship that culture has with immigrants, with marginalized people, all of this sort of affects the landscape of what grassroots recycling looks like in our culture. So, I mean, I think Samantha was right on. We're talking about systems that are conceived in order to address real local concerns. I mean, that we all have in all of our communities. And I mean, it's a sort of common sense thing that this would be different from community to community. And yet, of course, we see the prevalence of these one size fits all, large scale, and in terms of value and structure, exclusive models around specifically waste management, right? So I think there's a strange gap there in terms of like, why would we assume that a one size fits all system is most conducive for, I mean, take a community like New York City, which is just vastly diverse. And I think it's just a misapprehension that such a system would be functional in that kind of environment. And I think that's played out, of course, in the outcomes, how much actually does get meaningfully recycled. And then you can contrast that with something like the bottle bill, which despite its issues, the neglect that it's seen in the legislature that Blair and I are talking about and working on, is actually highly functional. And part of its functionality is the way that it empowers people on this grassroots level to participate in waste management, and like we're talking about, beyond waste management, cleaning up their communities, earning into communities that have been disadvantaged historically. So when we take this grassroots approach, it has byproducts, including positive environmental outcomes, but really beyond them in terms of this whole like holistic environmental justice way of thinking.
Again, picking up where Ryan so boldly took us in the conversation. I mean, I couldn't agree more with both of my colleagues, but so I'll just add, like I did before, something sort of related to that. There's no way that a system, that a circular economy, a real one, can ever exist unless there's grassroots pressure. Power does not give up its control unless the people demand it. And so that takes a lot of sort of labor-intensive sort of education of people to understand their interests and what's going to happen to them otherwise. I mean, the normal way that when I deal with things down at the state capitol or in Washington for that matter, it's really a discussion among the various stakeholders, they call them, which really are the powerful interest groups, about what they can all live with. And we've seen the outcome, as Ryan mentioned. We've been talking, and Alex mentioned, we've been talking about solid waste problems in the United States and in New York for decades, and yet only a tiny percentage, relatively small percentage of the solid waste ever gets recycled. The rest of it gets burned or dumped on the ground, or shipped somewhere else. And so that's not going to work. It's not going to work. It's not going to work for much longer. And we have to change the power dynamic. And so the grassroots stuff that Ryan was talking about, where you need to empower people at the local level, is obviously dead on. But we certainly need, in some ways, to think of it as almost a campaign to take the hand of the people who have been running the system where it is now into the ground, unintended, to one that really is beneficial to society at large. And that only can come out of demands at the grassroots level.
Right. Well, we've probably covered a little bit of this in there, but let's look at it, just to find the macro level. So, how do you guys see it now? How do you see the state of recycling, that's locally, nationally, as it is now, the current state, your honest opinions?
Well, from where I stand, with the changes that China made to its import policy for secondary materials, there was a period of upheaval in the recycling industry because of it relied so much on specifically Chinese import markets. It has switched to other import markets in other parts of the global South. And there was some hit to recycling that came about with these events, because recycling started to struggle for a while economically, and it's my understanding that it's pretty much back on its feet since then. But that's talking about recycling as a business and scrap activity, which is fine to do. I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. We've had the scrap industry in this country, as you alluded to, Alex, for hundreds of years. It's a proud industry. It's a good industry. And sometimes, especially with scrap metal and scrap recycled paper, it needed to use export to find markets. Should it have been better to try and find those markets here in the US? Yes, but that's what working in a global market economy means, that you have to do those kinds of things. All of that is kind of independent of what Ryan and Blair were talking about in terms of performance in recycling, and even more independent from what I'm concerned about is specifically plastics, and not so much plastics recycling rates, but the threats to human health and to ecosystemic health from proliferation of plastics. And as a scrap industry, Plastics don't really lend themselves by and large to that kind of model. They do for a couple of types of plastics that have good markets, and they don't for the rest, which are most of them. So that's my take.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't have a lot to add on like the knowledge level to that, Samantha, which I think was well articulated, but I want to expand on this piece, which is that, I mean, I think we can comfortably say the state of recycling right now is extremely dire. And on a global level, not much of what we would like to be recycled or repurposed or somehow constructively reused, and that's not happening. And I think a lot of it, at least in my view, is due to this gap thing. This is like the systems that are being proposed or being implemented don't provide the functionality that we need them to have. And also, I think to what Samantha's beginning to talk about, we're not just talking about one kind of, oh, we'll arrive at the recycling system that sort of works for cities. We're talking about cultural transformation as well, in the way that we look at how we interact with each other, how we interact with the materials we use. I mean, when we're talking about the circular economy, it's more than just recycling, right? It's also repurpose and reuse and reduction and a cultural change. And I think in some way, you know, you're talking about the history of scrapping, I mean, being centuries old, and in some ways, a lot of this stuff is intuitive and organic and exists in our communities and has forever. And it's almost like we've been conditioned to forget about this stuff, right? We've been brainwashed somehow to think that, oh, I don't have to think about it, or like the materials I use will just vanish or whatever. Of course, that's not the case. So I think for me, there's this question, if we're talking about solutions and getting out of this very dire situation, how do we drive that shift in thinking? And again, I think we come back to communities and the local level. It's really looking at these organic needs and what's actually happening, and not like what do we wish would happen or what are we dreaming about, but like what's the knowledge that already exists in communities about how to take care of themselves and their materials, and how do we kind of reclaim some of these things that I think have been lost and forgotten, or at least are hidden now.
One quick note. I said before it was over 50 years, the United States produced 50% more waste than it did 50 years ago per person. It's actually twice as much. Sorry, I can't even remember my own math very well. I guess I'm not a math major. It's 100% more than it was 50 years ago. 2/3 of municipal solid waste is either paper, foodstuffs, or plastic, to go to Samantha's point. And so I mean, when I say those words, you all know what we're talking about. We're talking about, you know, packaging is like a big deal. And yet in Albany, and as much in the rest of the country, the debate isn't like, how do we take the programs that really work well, make them better, and expand them? The debate, up until recently, was how do we organize a system where the industries run themselves to somehow figure out recycling? That's the way they think. Oppose the stuff that works and dream up something new where the industry regulates itself. That was the plan advanced by Governor Hochul 3 years ago. Now, my point is that like the climate catastrophe is the result of powerful interests controlling environmental policy and public health policy for too long. The same thing is happening when it comes to recycling, et cetera. And the only way to sort of deal with that is to encourage, educate, and activate the grassroots to deal with this issue, because otherwise we're going to have a big problem. I mean, if New York closes all its landfills in 16 years, where do you think it's going to go? And how much do you think it's going to cost to go somewhere, wherever it is that it'll end up going? I mean, some of you may be old enough to remember at one point there were garbage barges leaving downstate New York, heading to other places, and that it was featured on 60 Minutes. And people freaked out. The people that were receiving the garbage barges freaked out. And so it's a serious problem that we have to grapple with. And there's only one way in American politics to change the dynamic, and that's to activate the public. And the best way to do that is through grassroots activism. So just to I mean, again, I know that I may sound like I'm a one-trick pony, and I guess one trick is better than zero. But it really does come down to advocacy to change the dynamic, and the component, the cornerstone of successful advocacy is engaging the public. I'll stop there. I'll get off my soapbox. I'll expect you.
Yeah, all right. Well, I'm gonna combine a couple of those next questions because a lot of that's come at. We can expand upon that a little more. And yeah, Blair is definitely I won't go into it too much, but in my years as a subcontractor in the industrial, there's certainly a disconnect between companies, the policies and the laws and what's actually happening in those rooms, and the knowledge, the statistics, all that. There's a lot of room for improvement in that. But, just in terms of, you know, how have you seen Grassroots evolving along with the structure? Obviously we've talked about a lot of the structural gaps here, in lieu of or along with those kind of structural gaps there, is the Grassroots, is it evolving to fill it in? How could it evolve to figure out what else can be done to kind of address those? How can we get the Grassroots more involved in addressing some of those things on the policy, with industry, with some of the larger haulers and all that, who are kind of stuck in their systems, which just, yeah, there's a lot of gaps and everything to be forming, once it trickles down, and it's hard, even for mid-sized players, and of course on the Grassroots for them, because they see things, they'll see a lot of these issues, but how do you take it from there now and getting that where it can be changed, where these structural problems could be addressed or improved in that way? Any thoughts, suggestions relating to that aspect of it?
Well, a lot of my work simply involves collecting statistics on materials flows, whether it's garbage or recycling in different places and under different programs, and making it open, right? Because the world of waste management is a hidden world for a lot of reasons, not all of them nefarious. And it there's a lot, I think, to be gained by learning how to collect data that is already out there and track it, and look at it so that what you actually see, kind of like what Blair was pointing out, you see, decade after decade after decade, low quantities of material being recycled, or even lower quantities of material being separated for composting or other beneficial uses. And there, there has been a tendency and I have to confess that I was guilty of this when in my earlier years when I worked for the government. There is a tendency to think that community-based or grassroots solutions are too small in scale to make a difference. And if you're actually looking at the tonnage involved, they are very tiny. But those solutions have never talked about addressing vast tonnages. What they're offering, as Ryan points out, is much more complicated and robust and important on a variety of levels. And it can sometimes accumulate to vast tonnages, as it does with bottle bill redemptions. And everyone knows the data is out there. It's been looked at, a million ways to Sunday, that if a 5-cent deposit works, then a 10-cent deposit works even better. And we don't even know what a 25-cent deposit would be. Now or what it would do. There are equity concerns about adding costs to beverages, absolutely, that need to be factored in. But this is not some kind of an imaginary approach to effectively, safely, beneficially bringing in useful tonnage. It is something that has proven itself over and over again, and not just in New York State, but throughout the country. And so I would basically sum up using data for grassroots purposes, I think is incredibly powerful. And that's actually where I focus a lot of my work.
I think Samantha's point's really well taken, that visibility is so key. I mean, this shifting this hidden atmosphere away from the waste management sector, I think is like Blair's pointed out, when a lot of this stuff gets brought to light, it's shocking and it's galvanizing and people respond. So making it really visible, educating the public is essential, I think. And also, I just want to add here too, as far as what is happening in the grassroots space and how can that energy that exists in grassroots communities be sort of like harnessed to have a really transformative effect here. You know, we're at Sure We Can, we're privileged to work with the Alliance of Independent Recyclers of New York City, which is a new worker membership organization that exists to advocate for the interests of canners, the folks who collect bottles and cans here in New York, advocate for their interests to us as an ally, but also to advocate to elected officials and institutions. And this is a nascent organization, but it's created in the model of many, many other organizations worldwide that truthfully are much further ahead of us in terms of organizing workers, activating average people in terms of participating in waste management, changing the narrative around this type of work as being having a different role in societies, you know, and it's also manifested in really incredible institutional transformations, including state recognition, say in Argentina or Colombia, of waste pickers, canners as workers, with and the rights that go along with that, and the destigmatization as well. So we're sort of here in the U.S. Kind of at a baby level when it comes to this kind of organizing. But we've seen examples worldwide of what can come from creating a context where these workers who here in our culture are conditioned to be isolated, stigmatized, invisible, when you change that narrative and say, no, you're not on the outside, you're doing something essential, something that's critical to communities. Look at all the other people who benefit from it. Look at the other workers who are working alongside you. It's hard work, it's difficult, it can be dirty, but it matters. And once that shift starts to take place and the change in self-recognition among the workers, and then the organizing starts to happen, and all of a sudden there's a much more powerful voice in these conversations that's authentically rooted in that grassroots energy and spirit. So I think that type of organizing is really essential alongside the general public grassroots activism that Blair's been talking about. We sort of need to stand up, right? It's like the people who bear these burdens, who are affected by them, and that's all of us, but some maybe more than others, need to stand up and say, we can't just tolerate this status quo. Something's got to give. And again, there are solutions out there. There's folks around the world who are doing amazing things that we can learn from. We can't get so, I mean, again, this thing of like, oh, the things that work won't work here. You know, oh, it works over there, but it wouldn't work like that here. It doesn't. There's some kind of these gaps that we need to cross of like, if it works, it works. Let's invest in it. The bottle bill works. Let's raise the deposit. Let's take it like Samantha's talking about, beyond a higher deposit we can imagine. Deposits on types of materials we've never considered before. You know, a refill system oriented around deposits that could maybe take single-use waste out of the equation entirely. I mean, there's so much that's possible that is only paralyzed by the sense of, oh, not here, or oh, that wouldn't work. And you know, given the scale of the crisis, we have to be experimental, and we have to recognize what exists already that's working and bolster it and make it better.
Well, just another disturbing fact for all of you to sort of chew on. By the year 2050, it's estimated that by weight, there'll be more plastic in the oceans than fish. And so it's not just about our garbage. It's about human health, the health of our planet, and the stakes couldn't be higher. So my recommendations to people that are watching, observing, listening, whatever you're doing, get involved in an issue, and particularly one that you think you can win. There's nothing quite like advocacy success than actual success. So there's that, and that sort of dovetails on top of what Ryan was just talking about with regard to the bottle law. There's an active campaign to deal with modernizing the state bottle law so that it would increase deposits and increase the beverage containers that are covered under the law, et cetera. And so that would make sense and be, it's a good shot that we'll win, because the bottle bill was established in 1982, 83 through a ferocious grassroots campaign that was able to roll the beverage industry. Now, if you're interested, there's also a very important packaging bill that's under consideration in Albany, which not only would help put the producers of packaging on the hook for the packages they make, but also reduce the amount of toxics that are used in the print on the packaging, which is another issue we really haven't touched on. So there's active things that are happening. We happen to live in a state where there are good things that can happen and have in the past. If you're interested in trying to get more fun facts along the lines that I was just describing, or just look at cool charts, the State Department of Environmental Conservation put out a 10-year master plan on how to deal with solid waste the week between Christmas and New Year's. And they haven't talked about it much since then. But it's out. And you can Google it and find it, and it's chock full of fun things, like the number that I got wrong, which was a 100% increase in the amount of waste Americans generate since 50 years ago. So there are things, and there's reasons why you can't smoke in bars and on airplanes. There's reasons why there is a bottle law in the first place. There are reasons why New York has an aggressive climate law. God knows if they'll comply with it, but it is a good law. It's because of work of groups like Ryan's and the analysis from people like Samantha, harnessed into active advocacy campaigns that lead to policy change. So it can be done. We shouldn't be despondent over the depressing notion that there might be more plastic than fish in the ocean in our lifetimes. Maybe not mine, maybe Ryan's, because he's younger than me. But in terms of, averting catastrophe and advancing good public policy, it starts at the grassroots. And that's where, again, I'm on my soapbox. Alex, back to you.
All right. Well, to ensure we still have a little time left for questions, and we're going to do a little recognition of the group that Ryan mentioned just before, the Alliance of Independent Recyclers. Final question, just for everyone in attendance, as individuals, as a community, thoughts on what else we can do to support the grassroots more? What's a good starting point for everyone that want to get out there and do something that's going to be helpful to build this grassroots and, let that kind of go upwards through the greater environmental landscape? Thoughts, suggestions?
Well, I think there's a lot of potential in the area of trying to bring people who work in kind of the mainstream waste management industry into this discussion. I think there's been too much division between that industry as just being seen as nothing but bad, and grassroots efforts. I think that there are areas not of compromise necessarily, but more and more people, even in the waste management industry, are understanding the depth of the crises that we're facing, and actually the solid waste crisis in comparison to the climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, and things like that is not even the biggest one, but it's related to it. So I think that we need to listen to those voices. I'm thinking, for example, about how sometimes, and this gets to a question that's been asked, any discussion of exporting sorted recycled commodities, not pure trash at all, That's illegal and should never happen. It should never be exported from this country, but exporting things like scrap metal, I mentioned, or scrap paper, that any mention of any export of that is automatically negative or bad, right? And that's not a nuanced understanding of the way that recycling works, even among grassroots recyclers. So I think we have a big opportunity to bring in more people who have a lot of that hands-on experience in managing waste into a more progressive direction. That's what I would say.
I think that, well, I think the best way to evolve it, I mean, is to participate. And there's so many ways to do so. And I think the most meaningful and kind of simplest way is just to observe, open your mind and heart to this stuff, because it's everywhere, right? And we are conditioned to block it out in some ways, and that extends to the material itself and the people. So I would say, if you live in New York, redeem your bottles and cans. If it's inconvenient for you to do that, leave them out for a canner. Get to know your local canner. If you're activistically minded, call your reps to talk about the bottle bill. There's so many things to do, but I think the most meaningful thing is just to be open to transformation here. I mean, reflect on yourself, see what's going on in your community. There are so many groups and struggling for visibility, struggling to do this work, people with good hearts and strong wills, and yet they don't get the recognition or the support they deserve. So find whatever small, big way you can in the area where you are to just take that small step of participation. And that's how the grassroots works. It's going to mound up into a huge impact.
All right, I'll just jump in real quick before we hear from Blair. But since we have the picture up here, these are the members of the Alliance of Independent Recyclers. That, of course, Ryan is, well, you can see him right there in the center. So, he's working with them on a daily basis. And yeah, they're doing a lot of stuff. They're doing a lot of important stuff in New York. Take the time to unfortunately, Ryan's away, so we couldn't get a few of them on the call. In a future edition, hopefully we'll do that. Maybe we hear a few of their stories, a little more information on that. But that's them. Here they are. And hopefully, Ryan will be with them, continuing to do their good work. And Blair, if you want to jump in here.
Well, yeah, I guess, go to Sure We Can website, see how you can help them out. That would be one step. How's that, Ryan? If you're involved in any kind of organization, see if you can get this issue to be sort of discussed. If you're in the League of Women Voters, at your local synagogue, if you're involved in a tenant association. I mean, this is an issue that's not only the environmental issue and the public health issue that we've been talking about, it's also a financial issue. And so anything that you can do to activate whatever groups you're affiliated with at all to bring this to your local officials will help. As Ryan mentioned, the first step is always in some ways the scariest and the hardest, but it is really the easiest, which is to try to bring this issue to the attention of people like you, and try to weigh in with your elected officials to do the right thing. And while you're at it, go to Sure We Can website.
Okay,
Pay Blair for that.
We have a couple minutes left, so we'll take questions. I'll turn it over to Aaron, who's been on the chat, to read out any questions that have come in. He's also put up a link, I believe. We set up a little thing on LinkedIn. So if anyone has questions they didn't think of during the event, feel free to jump on that later and post them there, and hopefully one of us will see them and can get back to you with some information there. So Aaron, yeah, what do we have? We have 4 minutes left, so we'll get to as many as we can.
All right, we have a question from email that came in, and anyone who else does want to share a quick few questions, feel free to send them to the chat. The question by email we had is, Are there any cases that come to mind where concentrated volunteer efforts paid off with ongoing collection and redemption of bottles and cans in rural areas? Not talking one-offs or token collection efforts. What is a workable model for a small community? And that's our email question.
Anyone have any?
I could jump in maybe and say that at least
Feel free.
I'm sorry, was I hearing something?
I think it was just a little
Okay.
breakup. Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
Well, I mean, I don't live in a small community. I live in Brooklyn, so I'm kind of speaking a little bit abstractly, but I think the bottle bill system here in New York works for both dense urban communities and more open rural communities. I mean, it's just a matter of distance and scale. And of course, the contexts are different too in terms of like being able to transport materials, et cetera. In lots of cases, upstate, they have more access to things like cars and space so you can drive to a redemption center a little further away. The issue is one we're advocating really strongly on, which is investment in infrastructure so that that redemption center, say, is only a couple miles away of a drive from your little rural town rather than like 30 miles away. That's the problem we're trying to solve, is just making sure there are access points across the state and throughout different kinds of communities that, again, recognize that different contexts have different needs, so that in New York City, there's got to be more, it's got to be denser, they've got to have different limits. Upstate, it's a different context, there's different frameworks. So as it stands now, I think there are, the way the system exists now, it does serve the context that you're talking about, at least in abstract. Whether that redemption center has recently gone out of business, I couldn't say. You know, that's the issue we're facing right now, that this infrastructure is deteriorating because of neglect on the legislative level.
All right.
Thank you, Ryan.
We have one question that came in, and that will probably get us through our last minute. So, Aaron, if you want to share that.
Sure. Again, we're going to answer some of these other questions in a chat, a LinkedIn chat that we've added down here. I'm going to send it to you guys in a second. And our question that we have that comes from Mayfair Young is, in New York area, what percentage of recycling is done by for-profit corporations, any state organizations, and what percent is by grassroots?
I don't know if anyone has any stats, but it's not anyone have any idea, a rough breakdown.
I mean, I can speak to New York City, and the vast majority is carried out by for-profit corporations. Absolutely. There's no question about that. I do also want to respond to a question that came up about export and clarify what I wanted to point out there. When recycling, the scrap industry has existed in the history of the United States since it began. That was an economic activity, and it still continues. Recycling took on an environmental goal around 1970, and there was a big push to start collecting things, including plastic, that didn't necessarily have markets for them. If you don't have markets for something that you collect, what do you do with it, right? And so the push to build specifically curbside recycling led to the scrap industry coming and getting involved and seeking out markets on globally, just like all other trade in our country and in the world. Would it be nice to domesticate all scrap? Yes, I'm totally for that. But if you want to collect a lot of materials for recycling, if you're insisting they get collected for recycling in large quantities, they're going to need to find scrap export markets in some cases. We can't pretend that we don't live in a globalized economy. If we want to move away from a globalized economy, that's great, but we don't just need to do it with scrap. We need to do it with all commodities. So I don't think that we should necessarily single out scrap export per se as being part of the problem.
Right. And with that, I believe we've gone a little bit over the hour. So yeah, I'll just once again thank everyone, Samantha, Ryan, Blair, for taking your afternoon to get all this information. It's going to be on YouTube. We'll have the LinkedIn page if people want to for further questions or follow up. Daniel, Serica, if you guys have anything you want to add before we sign off.
No, just thank you all so much for being here.
All right. Yeah, everyone. Continue to hopefully you'll keep an eye on it, follow all, sure we can, public interest research group, Samantha's working group, of course, us at NYenvironcom and Daniel at Serica. And yeah, any future events, as long as you're on our mailing list or keeping an eye out, you'll hear about. And we'll hope to, put some more things together on related topics to continue the conversation. So thanks everyone who participated and everyone who may watch this on YouTube later or the other channels, and stay in touch, keep recycling and keep supporting your local grassroots guys, canners, whatever you can do. And the bottle bill, of course, go out there and vote for the bottle bill when it's on there, as high as they'll go. All right. Thank you all.